Sarah Moss's novel is about a wall, right, as a physical space, as an end in itself, but it's also about the ways in which boundaries are questioned or redrawn or perhaps sometimes erased. And so if you think through the boundaries here, you can also think about how these boundaries collapse or become complicated in Wall's telling. One of the essential boundaries that she wants to engage in this novel is the boundary that we perceive between the public and private realms, and the ways in which identity and questions of kind of deep personal attachment and worth, how those impact the ways in which we deal with the political, the social, the cultural worlds. This comes out on pages 63 and 64 in the ways in which Sylvie is kind of negotiating her identity as daughter and as woman. As Moss writes, and Dad said, "I won't have you wandering about like that." "So what?" I thought. "Hit me again. I dare you. In front of all these people. Let's have a public beating." He said, "You girls stay local if you no one with you. Hear me?" "Yes, Dad," I said. "We will." So as Sylvie works her her relationship out with her father and her sense of identity as daughter and young woman, what ways is that tested both privately and publicly in her experience? The negotiation of that boundary is kind of the central boundary that is explored within the novel. But other boundaries are explored as well and complicated, right? There's the sense of the boundary between the dead and the living, right? Sylvie's father, who's working out his connection and identity in terms of the ancient Britons here. When the basket weaver visits at first, she says, "I'm always trying to do what dead people tell me, spending days looking at and feeling and listening to some prehistoric object. I'm kind of trying to think their thoughts too." I thought, who are the ghosts again, we or our dead? Maybe they imagined us first. Maybe we were conjured out of the deep past by other minds. And so the boundaries imposed by time here become a little more complicated. In what ways is the line between the living and the dead become a little bit more complex in your reading? In what ways is the sacrifice of the ancient Britons replicated here? In what ways are their lives reinvoked here? In what ways are their lives reinvoked in aspects of identity that become so significant in this novel? As the prof says, death would have been a part of their daily normality in a way that we can't imagine. In what ways is death a part of our own kind of lives, and in what ways do we draw boundaries there between the dead and the living as means of understanding our own kind of place in the world? Geographical boundaries are significant here, particularly the ways in which bogs and shorelines mark the ends of spaces geographically. On 32, Moss writes, "Those bogs have always been special places for folk around here. Folk used sometimes to give their precious things to the bog." The sense in which bog exists between water and land. Another is the sand dune the sand dunes that mark the space between land and sea. In 44-45, Moss writes, "The sand dunes where it's remarkably easy to get lost. When we came to the beach, it looked more like a desert. The sea itself a fiction on the horizon." So as the tides go out and then come in what ways do the dunes mark the space in between that's there? Or Doggerland, the name archaeologists gave the human settlements now under the North Sea. So human space and the ways in which it's reclaimed by the environment or by the non-human world. Those spaces in between geographically. That how do you define a space that's part water, part land, is significant here. As these characters work out their relationship to the bogs. A sense of temporal boundary here is important, right, in terms of identity. As Sylvie's father works out his attachment, as Moss writes, out on England's blurred margins, geographically, politically, socially, culturally, temporally. The identity that's crafted there is significantly influenced by how he negotiates the boundaries of time. Dad said on 37, "It's a mistake to think that they had primitive minds and we don't." "Well," said the prof, "they weren't exactly British. Their identities were tribal, and they seem to have come from Brittany and Ireland, from the West." Dad didn't like this interpretation. He wanted his own ancestry. So that's something like he's trying to reach back in time and reclaim what may be a false identity here. He wants to, cross over the boundary of time and yet have his own sense of political geography reaffirmed by his participation in the life of this ancient people. Can you really go into that space and reclaim that identity? For Sylvie, it's a question of how she lives in northern England. As she notes as she's discussing life with the college students, that we lived up north. We were northerners. Up from where? It's not a different country, the north of England. And so in what ways does she think of herself as similarly English, and in what ways perhaps do the students see her as a very different, othered person, being outside of their experience of a more southerly England and London as a geography? The boundaries of gender are also significant here, right? The ways in which gender is controlled or regulated, particularly from the father's perspective, as he thinks about, taking the women out camping. Moss notes on 47, it was one of my father's themes, Sylvie thinks, the way women allow their inferior plumbing to shape their relationship with the great outdoors, that there's a distinct sense of otherness that works between genders. In what ways, does the father's identity here define that otherness? As Molly, the college student, looks at the whole recreation project, she says, "I just think it's a lot. If it's boys playing in the woods, your dad and Jim, they just want to kill things and talk about fighting." And so that sense in which male identity wants to attach itself to this more ancient violence. In what ways is that a significant part of the ways in which men craft their own identities in the present world? In the ways in which women relate to that, Molly will say a few pages later, and thinking about how women respond to that sense of anticipated violence. "The men came back late and a little excited, head up. Bloody hell," said Molly. "Do you think women have always been hearing the approach of men? In what ways does that violence on the horizon always kind of define women's sense of relationship with men, that impending violence that's there?" When Sylvie's father looks at Molly, he draws a sharp line between Molly and what his expectations of his daughter are. Dad knelt up and watched as Molly walked off, shook his head. "Spoilt little bitch. Sylvie, go help your mom." So he's drawing a clear line between the expectations he has of his daughter versus of the college student who's also on the camping trip, and how firm is that boundary in the end. And so it comes out in the end to the moment of impending sacrifice, where Mom was sitting down again. "Your dad came back," he said, "to tell you you'll be needed tonight." That moment in which the thing that Sylvie has dreaded but has been, secretly expecting, becomes more real. A lot of this novel is about domestic spaces and the boundaries there, and as Moss will relate, the ends of fatherhood, perhaps, and so Sylvie is very aware of the boundaries that get drawn in the domestic space and the familial spaces. "What's it like sleeping in the hut?" "Dark," I said, "very dark, even in the mornings, and we can hear each other breathe all night. There's no privacy." That sense in which she's trying to carve out her identity in this coming-of-age story, but against the closeness of family, a sense in which she cannot, mark that sense of privacy as a space in which to negotiate out her own identity as a young woman here. She feels her father's sense of violence at various points, the impending violence that's there. She experiences that violence in physical acts. A moment on page 60, when the men bring back a group of butchered rabbits for cooking. I looked away from the butchered rabbits, she thinks. You could see Dad wanting to see the small pink body skewered over the flames. So that sense of ancient, hunter that her dad wants to attach himself to, and the violence that's kind of a part of that, the kind of daily violence of hunt and gather. I felt Dad's gaze on me and knew with a shiver what he was thinking. My daughter. A possessiveness that's there, right, within the domestic space, a possessiveness that Sylvie feels, as her father watches her, and the question is, in what ways does the father's sense of extension of identity, in what ways is it real, and in what ways is it imagined? This comes with with a real physical marker of the ghost wall as they construct it. As Sylvie thinks about it, obviously it's not a real ghost wall. I know it's not real, I said, but none of this is real. The prof's just experimenting. But the question is her father just experimenting in the end as we go towards the imagined sacrifice? As she's thinking about what the men were doing up there on the moor, the prof says, we're seeing if we can make a ghost wall, what one of the local tribes tried as a last-ditch defense against the Romans. They brought out their ancestral skulls and arrayed them along the top. I could feel my skin shrinking and tightening. So it's the physical marker, the boundary of the ghost wall that creates an internal feel within Sylvie, a sense of whether or not, what this physical marker is going to mean to her in terms of body and physicality. And that's where we get to the climax of Ghost Wall, where she realizes that it seems inevitable of where this story has been going all along. They wanted to kill me at sunset. Why does it have to be me, I said, although I knew the answer. I was the person you can hurt. I was the scapegoat. They're insane, Molly said. They're completely lost. You completely lost the plot. You're young and vulnerable, and they think no one's going to stand up for you. I won't let them do anything, I promise. And come the moment, Molly wasn't there. The sacrifice that is anticipated throughout the novel is the thing against which Sylvie has to define herself and her vulnerabilities as a young woman, or as an adolescent coming into young adulthood. In what ways is she able to negotiate that in Moss's novel?